Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the new season of our seminar series running from August to December 2024. This event is brought to you by the Ateneo Department of Economics and Ateneo Center for Economic Research and Development, or ASERD. We are very excited to have you with us as we embark on another round of engaging and impactful discussions. For today, we will have a 40-minute presentation followed by 20-minute question and answer, providing ample opportunity for in-depth discussion. Today's presentation, titled Learning Among 15-Year-Olds in the Philippines and the COVID-19 Pandemic, Insights from the 2022 Pisa, examines the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on learning outcomes of 15-year-old students in the Philippines using data from the 2022 and 2018 Pisa assessments. It reveals significant learning losses, especially among males, public school students, and those lacking access to digital devices. The study highlights the need for targeted remedial interventions to address these disparities and improve the overall proficiency of Filipino students. The speakers for today are Dr. Leonardo A. Lanzona Jr., who is a professor of economics at the Ateneo de Manila University. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of the Philippines and completed postdoctoral studies at Yale University's Economic Growth Center. He specializes in trade, labor, and development economics with numerous publications both locally and internationally. Our second speaker, Dr. Geoffrey Ducanes, who is an associate professor at the Ateneo de Manila University's Department of Economics. He was awarded Outstanding Young Scientist in Economics by the National Academy of Science and Technology in 2014. His expertise lies in applied econometrics with published work in labor economics, international migration, education, poverty, and inequality.
Can I start now?
Yes, Sir Jeff, you have the floor po.
Thank you, Mayor. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending this seminar on this very rainy day. So I'm Jeff Ducanes, and together with Dr. Bush Lanzona, we are presenting our research output for the HREP ADMU project. So our area is basic education. We actually wrote two papers for the project, and we are presenting both. So I will be presenting first about learning among on this topic on the slide, but afterwards I will be handing the virtual floor to Butch for a discussion of the second study on the issue of decentralization and its impact and the impact of education policies on wages. Just to give a background, the COVID-19 pandemic has had a profound impact on education worldwide, affecting both the participation of students and their learning outcomes. The Philippines, in particular, experienced one of the most severe disruptions in the world. Enrollment in basic education fell by about 1 million students from school year 1920 to school year 2021, according to DepEd data. The country also had the highest number of days of school closures in Southeast Asia and the third highest in the world from the start of the pandemic up to April 2021. In fact, it was not until October 2022 that the public basic education system in the Philippines resumed face-to-face instruction. There is no official measure of the magnitude of learning losses in the Philippines at any grade level due to the COVID-19 pandemic. This is mainly because DepEd was unable to conduct standardized tests while there was a pandemic. And while some standardized tests have already been implemented in 2023, the data sets and the results have not been made publicly available yet, as far as I know. In December last year, however, the general results of the data sets of the 2022 Program for International Student Assessment, or PISA, were made available by the OECD. So the 2022 PISA in combination with the previous PISA, the 2018 PISA, we use it to measure the impact of the pandemic on learning losses. So the study attempts to answer the following questions. How has the COVID-19 pandemic and the adaptation of students and schools to the pandemic impacted student learnings? How were different subgroups affected by the pandemic, with subgroups defined by socioeconomic status, gender, and type of school, whether private or public? How did different adaptations to the pandemic, for example, the kind of learning resources used and access to digital devices, impact learning outcomes? And of course, what useful lessons can we learn from this episode? So again, this study analyzed the PISA data from 2022 and 2018. The specific target population of PISA are 15-year-olds attending educational institutions and who are in grade 7 or higher. The 2022 PISA data for the Philippines has a sample of 7,193 students, of whom 3,662 were females and 3,531 were males. Of the 7,190 students, 5,988 were from 153 public schools and 1,205 were from 35 private schools. On the other hand, the 2018 PISA data for the Philippines has a sample of 7,233 students, of whom 3,868 were females and 3,365 were males. If you divide it by whether they are in public or private schools, 6,068 were from 153 public schools and 1,165 were from 34 private schools. So from the beginning, let me discuss some of the limitations. So of course, the PISA sample is limited to 15-year-olds. And so in this analysis, we are sort of assuming that what is true for 15-year-olds is representative of what happened to other age groups in basic education as well. Also, of course, the number of Philippine schools and the number of students included in PISA is only a tiny fraction of the total number of basic education schools in the country, both public and private. So again, another assumption is that the sample obtained for PISA was representative of public and private school students in the country, because the sample sizes are big enough if the sampling was actually valid. So let me go to our findings. So as was already much reported on by OECD and news outlets, the average 2022 results for the Philippines in science, mathematics, and reading were virtually unchanged from 2018, except for a small increase in reading. There is both bad news and good news from this. The bad news from this is that the Philippines remained at or near the bottom of all countries in the 3 subjects. But there's actually good news also. In the Philippines, there was no actual decline in the country's overall performance. Many countries actually, in fact, experienced a decline in average PISA scores from 2018 to 2020. For example, if you look at those graphs on the right in this slide, other ASEAN countries like Indonesia, Thailand, and Malaysia experienced such declines. In Indonesia, for example, average scores in the 3 subjects, meaning math, science, reading, fell by about 3%. In Thailand, they fell by about 5%. In Malaysia, they fell by about 6%. And those are statistically significant declines. There was no such decline in the Philippines. In the subsequent analysis, we focus on the breakdown of the results by subgroups to see whether there was heterogeneity in the changes in PISA scores before and after the pandemic. So first, although there is little to no change in Philippine PISA scores overall, the pattern is actually very different by type of school. So, so this graph, for example, the first set to the left, that shows public versus private in science for 2018 and 2022. And then the second set for math, the third set for reading. So it shows that the scores of public schools in science, math, and reading were practically the same in 2022 compared to 2018. So almost the same for public schools. But for private schools, there was a significant increase in science and reading scores in 2022 compared to 2018. And in math, there was also a double-digit, although smaller, increase. As a consequence, the gap between public and private school students was wider in 2022 compared to 2018 in all subjects. So this suggests that public school students were the ones more likely to have been held back by the intervening pandemic. In fact, you can go further than this. One actually gets a very different picture of the Pisa 2022 results when students are disaggregated into public school and private schools. Philippine private school students are actually among the top performers in ASEAN, especially in reading. So comparing the Philippines against Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, and Cambodia, Philippine private schools were the top performer in reading among private and public schools in the 5 countries. Philippine private schools were also the second top performer in science. However, Philippine public schools were last in science. In math, Philippine private schools still did better than Indonesian and Thai public and private schools. The high ranking for Philippine private schools was not true in the 2018 PISA. So this means that this happened because Philippine private schools or Philippine private school students actually improved their performance from 2018 to 2022. But in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand, both public and private schools had declining scores during the period. A disaggregation by gender further reveals that changes were heterogeneous across gender. Overall, there was no statistically significant change for males in either science, math, and reading. For females, on the other hand, there was a double-digit improvement in reading from 2018 to 2022. A further breakdown by gender and school type shows females in private schools improved in science, whereas males in public schools deteriorated in the same subject. In reading, females in both public and private schools made a noticeable improvement, but the improvement was bigger in private schools. For males, only those in private schools managed to improve noticeably. So taken together, it would appear that males in public schools are increasingly being left behind. The PISA dataset includes a standardized measure of student socioeconomic status, which is a weighted average of 3 components: parental education, parental occupation status, and home possessions, like durable goods, like TV, and other appliances. Based on this measure, we group the students into 5 quintiles in each of 2018 and 2022, with the higher quintiles possessing higher socioeconomic status. So the results are presented in this graph. So of course, as expected, for each individual year, so looking at the bars of the same color, students with higher socioeconomic status generally did better than students with lower socioeconomic status, either in science, math, or reading. There is especially a relatively wide gap between the performance of the lowest quintile and the second quintile, and the performance of the highest quintile from the fourth quintile. So that's where you see the jumps. The scores of those in the second to fourth quintiles tended to be more bunched up. But if you compare 2018 and 2022, what seems noteworthy is that that gap significantly narrowed in 2022. So in this graph, for example, compare the distance between the first and fifth quintiles for each of the blue and orange bars for each subject. So in the orange bars, the gap is actually significantly smaller. Students in the lowest socioeconomic quintiles actually managed to improve their PISA scores across the 3 subjects from 2018 to 2022, while those in the top quintiles deteriorated. The difference in the change between the lowest quintile and the highest quintile was especially stark in math, where the lowest quintile managed to improve by 21 points, whereas the highest quintile declined by the same amount. So the results show that it is not socioeconomic status per se that drove the change in PISA scores pre-pandemic to post-pandemic. What could explain the differences in 2022 PISA performance? So we looked at the data. For instance, the type of digital device used most often when schools were closed appears or could have mattered. Of the students who answered the question on digital device most often used, over total for the Philippine students, 17% reported own laptop, desktop, or own laptop or desktop computer or tablet. 61% reported own smartphone. 12% reported a digital device shared with other family members. 3% reported a digital device the school gave or lent, and 6% reported not having any digital device. So comparing their performance, those who use their own digital devices, especially their own laptop, desktop, computer, or tablet, had the highest mean scores in science, math, and reading, followed by those who used their own smartphones. Those with no digital device scored the lowest in all three subjects. And then this figure suggests why students from private schools appear to have adapted better to the pandemic than public school students. So basically, this graph shows that private school students had more frequent access to various learning resources than public school students, except for uh, lessons broadcast over television or radio. This is especially the case for real-time lessons provided by a teacher from the school on a video communication program, which 47% of private school students said they use every day or almost every day compared to only 14% for public school students. And then to check for the robust correlates of performance, so we run some regressions to test the robustness of the associations presented in the previous slides. So in this slide shows the results of regressing science scores against socioeconomic status, gender, whether the students was in a private school or public school, type of digital device used during the pandemic, and whether they received real-time lessons from teacher via video conferencing during school closures. What we found was that having own digital device for use during school closures appeared to matter a lot. Having own laptop, desktop computer, or tablet added 64 points to the science score, or is associated with 64 points higher score in science, even after controlling for the other variables. Having own smartphone added 39 points. Being in a private school added 58 points. Students who received real-time lessons from teacher via video conferencing during school closures were higher in science by 22 points. Of course, socioeconomic status and gender mattered also. The results for the regression in math scores is qualitatively similar as that in science. So one possible difference is that the effect of being in a private school is smaller compared to its effect in science scores. Again, the results for the regression using reading scores is quite similar, except that the effect of having one's own digital device is higher. It is associated with 71 additional reading points, and also the effect of gender is higher, with females scoring 35 points higher than males, controlling for the other variables in the regression. In both science and reading, having received real-time lessons from teacher via video conferencing during school closures added 20 points to the scores. So in conclusion, the results presents a mixed bag. So on the one hand, students seemingly did not suffer large learning losses during the pandemic that put them behind earlier cohort of students. On the other hand, the Philippines is still at or near the bottom of all countries who participated in the 2022 PISA. We find heterogeneous impact of the pandemic on student learning. So again, just to summarize, private school students and female students on average appear to have adapted better to the pandemic compared to public school students and male students. Male students in public schools appear increasingly left behind academically. They should be at the top of the list for remedial programs. Students from the lowest socioeconomic strata, on average, continue to be far behind in terms of PISA scores, although they appear to have made greater gains than students from higher economic strata in 2022. So how schools and students adapted to school closures had a big impact on learning losses or gains during the pandemic. Students with no or limited access to digital devices, next slide please, scored significantly lower in science, math, and reading. Students who did not benefit from real-time lectures through video conferencing by teachers during school closures also fell behind those who did benefit from them, or who did not benefit from them. Okay, some policy implications, we just focus on two. It appears to us that a streamlined but well-designed and well-targeted remedial education program needs to be developed. The remedial program should be focused on developing the deficiencies in specific competencies that have been identified or could be identified in PISA and other standardized tests. There should be continuous monitoring and evaluation of the effectiveness of such remedial education program, which means having a proper baseline of the students' competencies and monitoring their progress over time. Priority target groups, such as those from the lowest socioeconomic class, could be incentivized to participate if necessary. There's also an urgent need for improved digital technology access. The study showed the potential of digital technology, first in limiting the negative impact on student learning of disruptions like the COVID-19 pandemic, or even more regular ones like flooding and other natural disasters, or the current one. We haven't had classes for 3 days already. As a tool also for remedial interventions. So in line with this, there's a need to review the status of the Free Internet Access in Public Places Act, which seeks to provide free public internet access to, among others, public basic education institutions and barangay reading centers. There's a need to give students better access to digital devices like tablets or laptops for use in their studies, or enable them to make better use of digital devices they already have access to, like cell phones. There might be a need to adopt video conferencing to allow for real-time interaction with teachers during school disruptions. These are, of course, very costly, but do a cost-benefit analysis. They might be worth the cost. Also, study the possibility of providing remedial classes via video conferencing, which seems to have been effective during school closures during the pandemic, as an alternative way to remedy learning losses or to achieve learning catch-up if face-to-face classes are too costly for students, teachers, or the schools. Of course, the problems of Philippine basic education are huge and long-standing and require reforms on many fronts to address, as discussed in the second EDCOM report. And these recommendations are just two of them. So that's the end of my presentation. Let me just acknowledge the following people who made key inputs in the preparation of our report. So thank you. I will pass the virtual floor to Dr. Bush Lanzona.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. Let me just share my screen first. Jeff provided a very microeconomic perspective on the issues facing the education sector in the Philippines. I took a more macro approach by looking at the implications of learning and education, particularly on wage growth. So let me just show my screen. So this is another study that we did for the project. I continued working on it even after the end of the project. And I came up with some very interesting results, which I would like to share with you right now. So the context is that there have been a number of reforms that have been implemented in the Philippines. However, a lot of these seem to have hardly affected the performance of the sector. And the idea is that the policies that work in some places may be weak in others, and then you have unintended negative consequences on others. So in other words, it would seem that the policies may depend more on the economic environment of a particular region rather than implementing a general program, and you wouldn't expect the same results that are coming out. No? So even before the pandemic, a consensus has already been made that there is impact in education crises. And this was further verified as by the observed learning poverty and the scores on Pisa. And several key issues have been identified: poor teaching materials, financing issues, teacher quality, technological innovation. It seems to me that the issues call for identifying what should be the key problem, no? Really focusing on a particular weakness that may have several consequences. Because if we're going to just do the reform piecemeal, it may not address the other issues that we're trying to face. So for this paper, I looked at three key factors: learning, education, and the wage. So there seems to be a dynamic going on between these three factors. And before, people were, the economists and other scientists were looking at these things, not as a whole, no? but looking at them individually. So, for instance, there have been studies by Colley, Heckman, Carnero, indicating that learning, especially at the basic level, can be reflected in terms of the education. In other words, they are not two separate things. That the more people are educated, the more learning that exists. And then with the education, there are some studies that have shown that education leads to higher wages. So there's been separate studies that look into these three factors. It's only now, after the pandemic, if we're going to try to achieve higher wages through education, quality education should allow for workers to adapt to the conditions in the labor market. We know that technological innovations have been happening, and this had resulted in new tasks, and it requires new skills in order to be productively employed. The thing, though, is that when you're talking about quality of education, there are two effects. You have the direct effect, which is the idea that you have a greater number of skilled workers in the labor market, which presumably will be employed by the firms. So therefore, you have a benefit arising from the quality investments. And there you also have an indirect effect, mainly on the workers themselves, in the sense that greater learning and education will result in higher returns to education. So for this paper, I used the regional basic education budget shares, the share that each of the regions are getting, as my indicator for quality. And this is because other studies have shown that regional differences can be used as an instrument for quality. So for the empirical model, I have wages. Wait, I have wages here. Sorry. I have wages, and then I have basic education, and then I multiplied it to the regional budget shares, no? To measure what will be the effect of improving quality or improving investment. If you have increased investments in quality, how will that affect the wages? No? So this is not a measure of the returns to education of basic education. The wage returns of basic education, but it's the coefficient here is trying to measure how much would be the effect, how much would be the increase in the wage returns if you increase the investments in basic education. But the idea is that this is the indirect effect. You must consider also the direct effect. if there are already so many skilled workers as a result of these quality investments, how will that affect the labor market? So it's probably there's going to be greater productivity, but there could be a negative side. There could be a situation where you have so many skilled workers who cannot find work. And so in the process, we could say that the reforms are not aligned to the conditions in the labor market. And so this thing could be positive or negative, the coefficient, meaning the direct effect of quality investments could be positive or negative, depending on how well the reforms are aligned to the needs of the labor market. Now, if you look at the data on regional basic education budget shares, you will notice that across time things are more or less very stable, no? But you find that in most advanced or more progressive regions, there seems to be a greater share, such as Calabarzon, Central Luzon, and of course Metro Manila. Right? So it would seem that just by looking at the regional basic education shares allocated to the regions, not the budget allocated to the regions, it would seem that the more progressive regions are given higher share. But actually, if you look at the budget shares per student, you will notice that more or less they're sort of equal. And in fact, for the more progressive regions, this seems to be somewhat lower. In fact, in this particular table, the poorest region is Caraga, and they got the highest share. So it would seem that there's an attempt to try to reach the poor regions, to try to make them have the same kind of service that the other regions are getting. And yet you still find the stability, no? You have the stability across time. And more or less, if you're looking at regional shares per student, it's more or less constant. Now, this uniform budget shares per student is actually indicative of a centralized system, no, of the DepEd programs. And the goal is to provide the same type of education to every student in the region and provide them with the same basic skills. So there seems to be a homogenization of education across the regions. And this is, as I said, a result of the centralized approach that DepEd has. And in fact, if you look at the basic laws, the basic education law, RA 9115, it indicates that the key function should be centralized to the DepEd. The DepEd will develop the curriculum, the books, and so on and so forth. But if this is different from the tertiary education law, which simply assigns CHED to be a regulatory and a supervisory agency. So there seems to be more decentralization in the tertiary education, allowing regions now, the state university and colleges to make their own, to create their own programs. Okay, so it would seem that actually this could cause some problems, because if you're after homogenization, and we know that there are different economic conditions across different regions, it may not really address the problems of the different regions. So if you look at, I did the regression from the model that I got. So there was a positive significant effect of quality. So if you just use the simple model to determine the wage returns of education, you will notice that basic education is a very low return, 3%. But with higher budget shares, you could actually increase that to about 34% and 35% if you're using either regional budget shares or budget share per student. But the thing is, if you look at the direct effects, these are all negative. The regional total basic ed share and the regional share to basic ed per student, they're all negative. So what does that mean? It means that after is creating more problems rather than solving the problems. And in fact, if you look at the sample selection variable, this is because some people have not reported any wages. So this will show whether wages of those people who reported for work and those who did not report for work are higher. No? They try to compare the wages of those who reported and those who did not report. And they found out that those who did not report are getting, in fact, higher wages. No? Now, if the DepEd approach is very centralized, it could exacerbate this problem. That a lot of the more productive workers are not finding work and are probably going abroad or maybe working in some other self-employment activity. So they're not actually using the whatever skills that they learn. So the conclusion is that if you try to calculate what will happen if, let's say, there's a 10% increase in budget shares, I found out that there's only a 0.4% increase in wages, even though it might seem to have increased learning, whatever the DepEd program has done. It has increased learning individually. For the community, it seems that these programs are not aligned to the needs of the community. So we need, therefore, apart from providing all of these remedial courses, providing better facilities, better schools, we need to think about how do we make our education more relevant to the community and to make sure that the people who graduate from basic education. In fact, there's a recent report that firms would rather hire their college graduates rather than high school graduates. So it would seem that this study is trying to explain why that is the case. The idea is that the kind of skills that are coming out from the DepEd programs are not really suited to the regional needs in the labor market. So the idea is that, of course, if it's centralized, it could increase learning better, perhaps, if it's focused on learning and so on. But that might not be enough. So one way to do this, we need to, apart from increasing learning, the basic education program should make sure that the skills that the workers who graduate from the basic programs are aligned to the needs of the labor market. And one way of doing that is through decentralization. Okay, that's it. Thank you. Okay, that's it.
Thank you, Dr. Ducanes and Dr. Lanzona, for the timely and very enlightening lecture. So we are now approaching our question and answer segment of the seminar series. We are encouraging participants to please raise their hands or type their questions in our chat box. We have Miss Catherine. So you, ma'am, you have the floor.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you, Butch and Dr. Ducanes, for this presentation. I do have a question, Butch, regarding your last point, about DepEd, to make sure that DepEd aligns its programs with the job demands. Right? I think we need to talk with other agencies for this to happen. I've been in a forum also where they're saying that DOLE, it seems, needs to be brought in so that they can also inform DepEd of the kinds of jobs that are needed. Also, the problem of employers or companies not wanting to hire fresh grade 12 graduates. How can we encourage them to actually look at our basic ed graduates as potential employees rather than wait for college students to fill in their workers list and their employees list. And I think that there should be a change also in the mindset of people. We think that I mean the K to 12 program was created so that those who want to who opt to take on a job after grade 12 should be able to, right, find employment. But again, not many people buy in to that
Yeah.
idea, no, because we think that of course a college degree is still the the best ticket, not to
Yeah.
so how do we navigate through all these
Yeah.
other parts of the problem, Butch? Thanks.
Okay. Yeah. As I mentioned, one possible solution is decentralization. The idea is that we allow the regional committees, the regional school boards to determine the kinds of programs and the kinds of skills that will be taught in the basic level. But that will require a lot of coordination for decentralization to work. I mean, we cannot just, of course, leave the poor regions by themselves. So apart from having a framework for education, we need to have some framework for coordination, whereby you allow different agencies to come in, DOLE, TESDA, and of course the firms themselves have to have a voice. No? So I think the goal, but if you have this law, this law that says that DepEd should take care of everything and centralize all the programs, and, the curriculum and so on and so forth. That kind of environment is not going to happen, right? I mean, in fact, I presented this already to the Congress, and they keep telling me that this has been done before, decentralization, but it has failed. But because I think the reason why it has failed is because there's no accountability program. No? I mean, you have all of these possible coordination framework that has been set up, but how accountable are those agencies that they will in fact deliver the kind of things that they should be delivering? So it's a more difficult task, but certainly I think it's something that we should be doing, especially if the goal is to make sure that the high school graduate should be able to find work already. By the way, in other countries this has been done. No? In Germany, for instance, what they do is that they have an exam that will separate the students, those who will go to college and those who can remain. And apparently that some people who remain in high school and learn skills are actually getting higher salaries than those people who went to college. So we need to understand that. And I think what's crucial is first coordination, and second, an accountability of all of these agencies. And I think that should be something that we should be doing. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you
Okay.
for the wonderful question, Ma'am Catherine Mr. Yu. Do we have another question from the audience? Do we have another question from the audience? You can type it in our chat box if you're shy. Okay, ako na lang muna habang nag-iisip kayo. This question is either for Dr. Ducanes or Dr. Lanzona. I'm very curious, sirs. What other capacity building approach or structural approach do you recommend in terms of aligning these graduates and making them highly valuable and highly employable in the workforce, even though, say for example, high school graduate lang sila?
Jeff.
Let me. So I think yung what Butch already mentioned earlier, industry should have an input in the high school curriculum, in the basic ed curriculum. Higher ed people should also have an input in the basic ed curriculum. Kasi when people go into this senior high school, so they do the academic track, tsaka non-academic track. For non-academic track especially, importante yung inputs ng industry. So what kind of competency should they have before they uh, graduate and before they become employable? And then for those who go to the academic track, dapat may input din yung higher ed people. What kind of competencies they should already have that will prepare them for higher education. This is related to another issue why people would rather hire college graduates. It's just that there are just too many college graduates in the Philippines historically. Lalo ng mga early 2000s. If you look at the unemployment rate by education level, usually pinakamataas yung unemployment rate dun sa mga college undergraduate tsaka college graduate. Although this is changing now. So the past few years, pababa yung unemployment rate. Ngayon, mga 4% na lang yata ito. Sometimes less than 4% pa. And that includes the unemployment rate for college graduates. So I think if you combine this tightening labor market for college graduates and then improvement in the education of the high school graduates, I think you will be able to see an improvement in the labor prospects or employment prospects of high school graduates. Okay,
Yeah.
Butch?
Yeah. Basically, as I already mentioned, I think the idea is that there must be a coordination between across different agencies, and it's important that we get the feedback of industry. We also would need the feedback from the parents, because probably the parents are the ones really demanding that higher quality education. So that kind of mechanism where people are giving an input would be necessary. And I think that the best institutional setup that could allow for that kind of exchange, of feedback and monitoring and all of these coordination. I think that a decentralized system would be the best way of doing that. Unfortunately, though, it seems that there's been some mindset on the part of most of the lawmakers that this is not going this cannot happen because of the weakness of the LGUs. But it's not just the LGUs. I mean, of course, the idea is that we need to support more the poorer regions, and that's what we've been doing anyway already. But the idea is that there must be a real. I mean, it's already been done. But it has not been fully implemented, and I think it's time we should think about how to make this particular change more effective.
Thank you for that, Dr. Lanzona and Dr. Ducanes. Ma'am Catherine Vissery, you have another question po?
Yes, sorry. I'm just curious if you have any information or input in relation to TESDA's role in all of this, because I remember when we were peddling to the public the K-12 curriculum, we actually had input from the academe, from the higher education institutions. We had some input from industry through TESDA. And it looked like a very rosy picture, with the three CHED, DepEd, and TESDA working together. But then things fell through, and I think it's the TESDA that's like the weakest link. So I was wondering if you have anything that you can say about
TESDA. Yeah, actually, I've done some studies on TESDA, and my major recommendation is that, like CHED, they should just simply be a regulatory agency and allow the private sector to determine, what kinds of courses it will be available, that should be offered to the students. Because the problem is there's a conflict of interest. They're the ones monitoring all of these technical schools, and yet they're also the ones providing most of it. So a lot of the resources of TESDA are going into these kinds of training instead of allowing the private sector to really find out, what are the demands of the industry. I think the private sector would be in a better position because what TESDA is providing right now, it's like essentially they're providing skills for people to go abroad there, like caregiving and things of that sort. I don't think that's a kind of uh, skills that we would need in the regions. So I think there must be an institutional reform in TESDA where its role should be properly defined simply as a regulatory and supervisory agency, making sure, of course, when you have private schools, doing much of the work, we're not sure about the quality of that. So TESDA must be there to monitor and check, how good are the kinds of courses that are being offered by the private sector, but it should refrain from offering the courses themselves. And that's I think the thing that we should be doing here.
Thanks. Thank you.
Yeah, just
Thank
to
you
add
for that.
a little bit. Yeah.
Yes, Sir Jet.
Okay. I think one of the problems also nung when senior high schools implemented was yung kasi 'di ba TESDA certifies NC1, NC2, NC4. So in the beginning parang medyo magulo eh. Parang naging competition ng TESDA yung senior high school kasi they were supposed to offer NC1, NC2 level already. Ang problema pa sa senior high school tech walk, wala namang equipment. So it was up to TESDA to actually tell them what the standards are. So it's a difficult issue that I think has to be maybe hopefully the EDCOM too will be able to deal with this better. Parang yun narinig ko, the current plan is to leave NC1 and NC2 to senior high school, and then above that, TESDA will be the one in charge already.
Yeah, it's also
Okay.
important to take note yung performance of the private sector. The private sector seems to be doing very well. And the idea is that it's not subject to the rules of DepEd, right? So I think, again, that's a point against centralization. If we allow more independent thinking on the part, for the different schools, maybe if we allow a greater role that the private sector would play in the education sector, that could be one of the solutions.
Although comment lang, no? I think decentralizing DepEd is like will remain a dream. I don't think it will really happen during our lifetime. Anyway, that's just a personal comment.
Yeah, I understand. Yes, as I said, I presented this in Congress, and it's really very hard to change the minds of people there. And but a lot of studies have already shown that there's a need to do this, to do the decentralization. It's a lot of work. I mean, of course, but the idea is that it should be the right direction. I mean, if you look at Vietnam, for instance, right? Vietnam, in spite of the fact that it's not really a very rich nation in terms of its economy, and yet it's able to provide very good learning and very high scores in Pisa, and a lot of people are attributing that to the decentralization, to the decentralized system in Vietnam. So
maybe Butch, decentralization is a strong word that people don't like it. Pero for sure, there should be greater autonomy in decision making at the local level.
yeah,
For example, if yung findings sa PISA, why did private schools do better than public schools? For sure, one reason is that private schools had more flexibility to deal with the pandemic, di ba? So, kung public school ka, you have to wait. Ano ba yung bibigay ng DepEd? ano ba yung policy ng DepEd. So you had to wait for this broadcast, TV broadcast, yun yung gagamitin mo. Pero kung private school ka, you can try to generate resources and then try to adjust based on yung local context, whatever it's available to you, what you can get, kung nasaan yung mga estudyante mo, and so on. So maybe, even in the PISA context, importante siguro yung, naging factor siguro yung more devolved decision making.
Sir, we have one final question from the audience, from Mr. Diego Joaquin Santiago. Are these communities in need that lack the resources have the ability to organize and bring these problems to the proper institutions that can help them?
Well, right now, I would doubt that, no? Because of the system that currently exists. So DepEd controls a lot of the major functions of the basic education system. So right now, there's no, as I said, there's no feedback mechanism. There's not much coordination existing across the different agencies, and a lot. You can attribute that mainly to the way DepEd, administers the current sector.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Lanzona and Dr. Ducanes. Unfortunately, we only have enough time for that final question. For the other questions that we have been receiving through the chat box, we can opt to send via email na lang. So once again, we end this wonderful and very enlightening seminar series. We'd like to thank everyone who were able to attend. So please, as for the final slides, please visit the website for materials from our previous seminars. It's available there. And also, previous seminar series videos can be found in the Ateneo de Manila University YouTube page with the playlist titled Economics Seminar Series. For all the participants here, you can request, the request form for the certificates link can be found on the chat box. And please answer immediately, as it is only open for 2 hours after the session. We would like to thank, of course, our speakers, Dr. Ducanes and Dr. Lanzona, our participants, and most importantly, our support team, Ms. Danny Andres, Kenneth Arno Noble, and Mr. Rodel Crisostomo, for making all this possible. So before 5 o'clock arrives, please may we ask everyone to open their cameras for a final picture taking.
Hello po, I'll be facilitating
Danny,
the
are you
picture
ready?
taking. Yes, ma'am. I'll be facilitating the picture taking po. So last 3 seconds for everyone to turn on their cameras. And if you can't turn on your cameras, that's all right. You can do a Zoom react. Okay po. So there's 2 slides on my screen. So I'll be taking the photo twice. So last 2 seconds for anyone else to turn on your cameras. All right. First slide, let's have the photo in 3, 2, 1. Okay, for the second slide, taking another photo in 3, 2, 1. All right, thank you very much. Back to you, Dr.
Okay, once again, we thank everyone for participating in this enlightening and, may I say, very timely lecture. Thank you so much, Dr. Ducanes and Dr. Lanzona. We are looking forward to reading the final
Thank you.
paper.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay, bye.
Thank you.